Hi, my name is Riane and I'm a volunteer, and today I'm going to read to you about the history of Scrabble. Alfred M. Butts was a young teen in 1913, the year the crossword puzzle was invented. He loved doing them. A native New Yorker, Alfred would work on crosswords in class, in the streetcar on the way home, or in his favorite hangout, a treehouse in his backyard. When Alfred grew up, he kept right at it. Only now he did extremely hard crosswords. The Great Depression of 1929 hit the Butts family hard. Alfred, an architect by trade, was out of work, as were millions of other Americans. With time on his hands, naturally, Alfred did countless crosswords. One afternoon, in 1933, as he worked away on one, he suddenly had a brainstorm. Maybe he could take the basic idea behind the crossword puzzle and turn it into a board game. Off went Alfred to his workshop behind the house. As he tinkered, the first thing he decided was that there would be no dice in the game. He didn't like them. First, because they were associated with gambling, and second, he considered dice games to be mostly luck. Instead, his game would test and develop players' thinking power, especially their word skills. On a sheet of architect's blueprint paper, he created colored squares, then glued the sheet to a carefully crafted wooden board. Next, he made exactly 100 little wooden tiles and hand-painted a letter on each. Frequently used letters, especially vowels, appeared most often but had the lowest point value. And letters such as J, Q, X, and Z, which are used the least often in English and therefore are the hardest to place, had the highest point values. As he worked, Alfred jotted down the other rules of the game, and finally he gave it a name, the game of It. Alfred was quiet and shy. He was no salesman, and he didn't have an interest in selling his game. All he really wanted to do was enjoy the game of It. Whenever the chance arose with family and friends, he would play the game by the hour. Years passed. Finally, after repeated attempts, Alfred's wife succeeded in getting him to do two things. First, she persuaded him to change the name. The game of It became Crisscross. Next, she talked him into showing his creation to game manufacturers. She was sure they would be smart enough to buy her husband's clever game. They weren't. Instead of interest, the only thing that they showed him was the door. Then 1948 rolled around. 15 long years had passed since Alfred invented the game. One of his friends during this time was James Bruneau, a social worker. On many occasions, James and his family had played crisscross at Alfred's home. One evening, as they played, James had a sudden inspiration. "We could sell the game, be business partners," he exclaimed. "No, I've already tried selling it to some of the big companies," said Alfred. "There's no interest." "Well then, we could manufacture it ourselves. Start our own company." Alfred hemmed and hawed. He gave every reason that he could think of to scrap the idea. But James persisted. "How about doing it this way?" he said. "We'll make the games together, but my job will be to sell them. You won't have to do anything on the selling end." Alfred's eyes brightened. Well now, that might just work. An agreement was struck, and Alfred and James were in business. First, they changed the name of the game again, this time from Crisscross to Scrabble. James came up with this name. Scrabble, he thought, was sort of like the game itself, since the action always started with players scrabbling around after a bunch of tiles. The first manufacturing plant was James' living room. There, the two men and their wives went to work, turning out the games by hand. Soon, because it made a mess of the house, the operation was moved to an abandoned schoolhouse. At that point, Mr. and Mrs. Butts bowed out of the manufacturing end of the business, and the Bruneaus took over the actual making of the games. In 1949, in their first full year of operation, they assembled 2,251 copies of Scrabble. Though they sold them all at $3 apiece, they were losing money. Making each set was costly and time-consuming, and business was simply not brisk enough to turn in a profit. By early 1952, the Brunos were ready to throw in the towel. Sales had slumped to an average of 16 games per day. They had hardly enough money to put food on the table, and let alone pay off their mounting debts. Then something strange happened. Towards the end of 1952, sales skyrocketed. Overnight, the demand jumped to 107 sets per day, and then it doubled, and doubled again. Orders were coming in faster than they could fill them. The Brunos and the Butts were baffled as they were pleased. What had caused the game's sudden surge in popularity? It took a while, but they finally learned the answer. While on vacation, one of the owners of Macy's department stores had played the game and loved it. Returning to New York, he asked his game department to send a few sets up to his office. And after learning that none of the Macy's stores carried the game, he gave orders to stock every store in the entire country. Within the year, requests for the game were far beyond what the Brunos could fill. Together with Mr. and Mrs. Butts, they sold the rights to manufacture and sell Scrabble to the Selcho and Writer Company. The two families made a fortune. As for the game, the homemade brainstorm once known as the Game of It is now the second best-selling board game in the United States, topped only by Monopoly. And here are some fun facts about Scrabble. It took Alfred Butts almost a decade to finalize the letter's point values. Scrabble has been translated into more than 30 languages, and there's also a version in Braille. Alfred Butts was not the only person swept up by the crossword puzzle fad. In the early 1930s, men's shirts and women's dresses, shoes, and handbags were all patterned with crossword designs. And finally, there are now video game, computerized, and travel versions of Scrabble, not to mention advanced game boards. There are also thousands of Scrabble computer clubs and tournaments around the world. Thank you.